Right, well, good morning and welcome to the final day of this year's Orkney International Science Festival 2025 and the John D. Mackay Memorial Lecture. This memorial lecture commemorates the life and work of John Dee, as he was known, a brilliant Papa Westray man born in 1909, who was an inspiring teacher and who opened up fresh horizons in education in the community. So as I say, today is one of mixed feelings for me. It's the last day of the festival, but it's actually a pleasure to be hosting this talk, and I'm getting to meet our speaker in person for the first time. I've hosted Mark twice online, so it's a great pleasure, Mark, to actually meet you in person. Our speaker this morning is Dr. Mark Cooper of the University of Washington. Mark is a retired biology professor from the University of Washington in Seattle. His doctorate in biophysics is from the University of California in Berkeley, and he has a deep and passionate interest in archaeology and ancient ships, as you'll soon find out. Mark first saw stone Neolithic monuments when he visited Scotland in 1986, while he was working as a space and gravitational biology postdoc associate with NASA. Mark's current research into prehistory boats stems from his interest in the dynamics of organisms and vehicles as they move and navigate within fluids as well as gravitational fields. Mark is wanting me to tell you that he's also a bona fide member of the Finn folk, a zebra fishologist, and he'll tell you what that means in just a minute. Today, and this is very newsworthy at the moment, Mark's going to show us how it's possible to transport a 6-ton stone slab many hundreds of miles from Scotland to Stonehenge. He'll describe possible forms of boat construction that would have been strong enough to cope with the Irish Sea, the North Sea, as well as the Pentland Firth, and the methods of navigation, which implies systems for measurement of length and time. Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you for having me here to speak to you today. I came here in 2018 after I'd done a talk in Glasgow at a biomedical meeting, and I took a tour and ended up at the Nessebrugger, and I'm sitting in some bleacher stands right in front of structure 10, which was being excavated at the time. It's now known as the cathedral, some type of temple, and I will discuss that structure in detail. When I was listening to the docent talk about that, she said, recently we had a member of the audience respond to our question, what are all these rectangular pieces of stone all over the nest? And the fellow raised his hand and goes, I think those are roofing tiles. And they said, that's a great idea. We'll talk to a roofer about it. He goes, you don't have to. I am one. And I fix roofs like that. Let me show you how it works. And so I was listening to this story and how welcoming the people at the Nessebrugger dig were to input from people in the public. But I was sitting there thinking, if you had all those stone tile roofs, you must have had pretty strong timber beams. Where's the timber on Orkney to create that? And I sort of heard rumors that people were thinking about driftwood, and that didn't make any sense to me. Driftwood is good for bonfires, but not for roofing. So I began thinking, well, I must have moved it from the Caledonia forest across the Pentland Firth, and that sort of stirred up my investigations, and that's what's leading me to this discussion today. Last year, you may have heard that an amazing discovery was made at Stonehenge. The most sacred stone, the altar stone, was discovered to come from northern Scotland, somewhere in the Orcadian sandstone basin. And it's 6 tons. It's 15 feet by 3 feet by 1.5 feet. And so how did they move it? Dragging it over the ground, you still have to cross valleys and rivers to get to Stonehenge. So the issue of moving it over water becomes more plausible. And so I'm going to talk to you about the history of moving megaliths over water, how people did that, both in prehistory times and historical times. And if you go to London, you may have seen the Cleopatra's Needle. And that was taken from Alexandria to London in 1877 in a tube-shaped barge. And I will talk to you about that. But I think your ancestors were moving megaliths long before the Egyptians were. And so the question is, who among them were able to do this? Since the 12th century, people have believed that Merlin the magician, the wizard, King Arthur, brought the stones to Stonehenge from Ireland. So that's one hypothesis. The other hypothesis is that it's engineers. And then the question is, what's the difference? Because when we look at what engineers are able to accomplish, it is sort of wizardry. Now, before I get started, I need to explain something about the audio. This is Plan B. I sort of anticipated there might be incompatibilities between US and UK videos, and we encountered that. So this is a YouTube with no narration. Once I activate it, I'll just have to keep talking. So, but good news is I'll end on time. Okay, so one other thing. I was born in the state of New Mexico at an altitude of 3,700 feet. That's about 2/3 of the way up Ben Nevis. So you might consider me to be a Highlander. But actually, I'm a lowlander, New Mexican. I lived at the lower southern part of the state. The state capital, New Mexico, is 7,200 feet, the highest state capital in the United States. So we call ourselves the land of enchantment. We should also call ourselves the land of astronomers. And in terms of the magical world, most of the people I knew in the land of enchantment were Muggles. But there was one wizard who lived down the street from me. He was an astronomer, and he did many things, built his homemade telescopes. He had a giant one in his backyard. He also put them up on a mountain at the university. And why do we consider him to be a wizard? Well, he's an astronomer, optical engineer, and an adventurer. In 1930, he discovered Planet X. And Planet X was an American rock group, but not at that time. And Planet X was the dwarf planet we now call Pluto. So this was Professor Clyde Tombaugh. And he was central to making the land of enchantment a place for the land of astronomers. Before he passed away, he asked NASA to put some of his ashes on a spacecraft, the New Horizons spacecraft. So right now, about 300 grams of his ashes are speeding through the Kuiper Belt. And in about 5 years' time, about 100 years after he discovered Pluto, he'll exit the Kuiper Belt. But for right now, he's Lord of the Kuiper Belt. Okay, so I'm going to start the talk. So moving megaliths over water. I've mentioned to you that if you go to London, you'll see an obelisk that was taken from Cleopatra's palace. It had fallen over centuries earlier, gifted to Britain, but moved by an ingenious barge. It's a cylinder of iron, and it was towed by steamships. And then once it got up the Thames, it was taken out. Now, I'm going to talk to you today about a different journey of a megalith, the altar stone. And we're talking about transport from about 4,500 BCE to 2,500 BCE. So, was it feasible to do this? Was it tractable? Was it optimal? These are the questions that engineers ask. It's a 6-ton stone. And as I mentioned, it's 15 feet by 3 feet by 1.5 feet. What type of boat could be used? Well, what I want to talk to you is that your ancestors may have created a wooden barge, essentially putting the altar stone inside the barge. And here I've sort of photoshopped in the Cleopatra's Needle after it was encased in iron. And you can see the steamships in the background. This is the harbor of Alexandria, 1877. They're about to tow it to London. So that plastic bottle shows form and function. And hopefully the audio will show this. So I've put 2 stones in this plastic bottle to illustrate the physics. That's a Neolithic barge, my model. Okay, so it's unlike a British mystery, I'm telling you the ending, okay? The altar stone is going to be one of those stones, and there's going to be a stone from Stonehenge that we're going to borrow to counterbalance it. And that stone is stone 68. And it's very unusual, it has this longitudinal groove. Water didn't make that, rain didn't make it. Neolithic masons put that groove there. So if you move that stone by sea, it would make a journey of about 1,800 miles. And we might use different boats to go up the River Avon versus the long journey from the Orcadian Basin down to the mouth of the River Avon. So the hypothesis, one, is that this stone, labeled stone 68, the grooved bluestone, circumnavigated Britain in 2450 BCE. So that's the yellow dot, going all up through the Irish Sea, making stops at its point of origin in Wales, but also stopping along to visit the Irish pharaohs in the Bend of the Boyne, and then picking up the altar stone in this barge, maybe a different log, and then being transported down this long journey. So why would they do that? To paraphrase JFK when he was talking about sending people to the moon, we choose to do these things not because they are easy, but because they're hard. So 100 years before Stonehenge, the final construction of Stonehenge, Egyptians were moving tens of thousands of stones across the Nile, in the Tura quarry. Each of them weighed about 2.5 to 15 tons. And they're being transported across the Nile, which has a steady flow, not major wave action. But here in the Northwest Isles of Northwest Britain, you have, complex seas, tidal flows. And yet the archaeologists have determined there are at least two known megaliths that were moved over water. One in Spain, near Valencia, and the other one in the Gulf of Morbihan. So shipping stones to Stonehenge, the how and the why. If you look at this woodcut from 1741 in Greenland, you see a chain of umiaks towing a dead whale. It's a bowhead whale, 80 tons. And they're using a skin-on-frame boat, which is called an umiak, and it has protrusions of its gunnels called horns, so it's known as a horned umiak. So these are the type of boats that I believe were in common use here. They were the SUV of the Arctic and the subarctic. And we have evidence of these skin-on-frame boats from cave paintings in the late Pleistocene, the Ice Age, in the Cantabria Mountains. So this is the Magdalenian culture. And you see what looks to be lashings of these near the gunnels, a long stringy symbol, which is called a stringer. And the dots, I think, are representation of water. Now, if you look at the longhorned cairns of Orkney and Caithness, you see, if you looked from above, the outline of a horned umiak. In fact, there's one just out here at the headland to the harbor. It's called the Head of Work, and there is a longhorned cairn there. Now, these are oriented in various directions, some cardinal directions. Sometimes they're oriented toward the solstice, but other places are not clearly understood. Why would this boat be so prevalent here? Because of your complex seas. It has a primary keelson, which lies inside the hull, and it's like the backbone of the boat. And it also has high freeboard, allowing it to withstand wave action. So what is the meaning of Stonehenge? Professor Timothy Darville, keeping time at Stonehenge. So I'm going to talk to you now about the evolution of timekeeping, linking and sinking in the Neolithic. So you all know the butterflies of Brittany, but if you look at these carved stones, they may show a narrative using these symbolics. And these same types of Brittany butterflies are found in a chalk drum that was buried in Yorkshire about 3000 BCE, about this size, and it too has this X symbol with a cross, or crossbox motif. So if we go with the idea that they may be astronomical symbols, symbols of space and time, okay, what other type of information can we gain from the art and architecture here in Orkney? This is the Nessa Bradgar reconstruction about 2800 BC, and we see this cathedral. And at the northwest buttress of it is a carved ball that was excavated, sort of like a Masonic offering. And other places in this building, there was an arm of a human. And so this shows a recently excavated threshold stone, which to me looks somewhat analogous to the altar stone that you might find, that is found in Stonehenge. In the back of this chamber is a triangular stone that has triangular motifs pecked into it. And this carved stone ball, that's not to size. But if we take that stone ball and we juxtapose it to the motifs that we see on this chalk drum from Yorkshire, we begin to say, well, astronomical symbols. This cathedral is oriented towards the sunrises of the equinoxes. And we may be looking at the dynamics of celestial deities like the sun and moon. And that light would come through the opening for the cathedral. And in that way, it could serve as an observatory. That's a hypothesis. Now we know from the Greeks and Romans that there was a pantheon of gods in the Bronze Ages. And so I'm just putting some of those gods, the different variations of the sun god, Helios, Apollo, Zeus. They did have a goddess for the day, Hemera, and a goddess for night, Nyx. And the moon was female, Selena. And if you look at the eyes, one is masculine and one is feminine. The brow ridges that are common on men, and a strong nose. And so if we look elsewhere in the Neolithic world, all the way down to the Mediterranean, in Malta, we see well-defined figures of an Earth Mother. And at about the time that we're talking, 3000 to 2500 BCE, these temples at Nidra, the opening during the sunrise of the equinoxes illuminates the back part of the chamber. And that's probably what we're seeing at the cathedral. Now, so I took this carved ball, or replica of it, and I attached a cord, and my wife's a physics professor, and we went out to Lake Washington, which is sort of like Loch Stennis, and this is time-lapse, which I did for much of my career. There's the pendulum, and the length is set to the Neolithic Longfoot. Now, moving objects in there, you're going to see the moon. We're going to be photobombed by a barge. It's fortuitous. And over there on the left, you'll see a glow. That's the moon about to cut through a notch in the mountains. And I'm doing this in time lapse, clocking out the time. We'll show that once again. And so this would be a possible Neolithic ritual and also a calibration ceremony, because if you're going to use the movement of the moon appearing on the horizon, if we took a Neolithic minute and defined it as the time it takes for the moon to move half a diameter in the sky, and then we find what length does it take to get 50 swings for half a moon or 100 swings for a full moon movement. Now we have a way of calibrating a Neolithic stopwatch. Now, I'm now using a Neolithic invention I believe would have been used, straw haggis. It's a bagel bag stuffed with barley straw, and I'm going to toss it like a chip over the edge of a gunnel of a ship. And what I'm interested in doing is measuring the speed of the stream. And I've pulled out my Neolithic stopwatch, and that cord that's attached to my belt is 10 feet long. Once I feel it tug, I know that it's past my hip and gone back 10 feet, and I haul it up. It took 7 seconds for it to reach tautness. That's about 1 mile per hour. So this type of tool could be used in tandem with your hands, and also using the thing as a plumb blob to figure out distances and speeds of headlands, clouds, and the speed of your boat. So linking and sinking, now I'm taking you to Ireland. And on the left, you see the stones of Stonehenge. And what we see is that many of the elements and motifs that are represented in Stonehenge come from Scotland, Central Europe, local sourcing of sarsen stones, Welsh blue stones, and an Irish moon motif. But if you look, you'll see that horseshoe just inside a circle of the sarsen stones. So you have a moon symbol and a possible sun symbol coming together. That's what happens during an eclipse. And if you draw lines between the station stones of Stonehenge, you end up with something that looks very similar to the Bruggar butterfly. Now, this altar stone is aligned with the winter solstice sunrise and the summer solstice sunset. So its sharp leading edge seems to have been a central part of the construction of this monument. So this cycle of the eclipses is called the Metonic cycle, after a Greek astronomer. It's also known as the Saros. It's 18.6 years. And so to teach this as a motif, an element, a unit of time, you could take a piece of twine, and that's what I've illustrated here, to show young people the Bruggar butterfly. And that same symbol is on the roof box of the Newgrange Passage tomb. So archaeologists are now viewing Stonehenge as both a solar and a lunar calendar. And it's important to view that not just as a static system, but something that's dynamic. And I'm going to go back to the Fulton drum, the smallest one, about this diameter. And several archaeologists have suggested if you wrap a cord 10 times around this drum, you end up with a Neolithic rod, which was the unit they believed was used to map out the rings of Stonehenge, the stones. Now, one thing that you'll get in these alignments is shafts of light and shafts of shadows hitting the altar stone. And so on my balcony in Seattle, I noticed similar sorts of shadows. And so I'm going to go into time lapse, again using the Neolithic stopwatch, which is set to the Neolithic longfoot, 32.2 centimeters. And it clocks out a second, a Neolithic long second, that's my definition, which is 1.2 times our modern second. Now, if you'll see in time lapse, I'm doing 1 minute of swings, that's 1 minute, and I pause for a minute. And then I do another 1 minute of swings. So there's doing that 30 seconds, and then 30 seconds of a pause. Now you'll see a sun dagger beginning to form, a triangular sun dagger. And you'll quickly see that it shrinks and disappears. It's sort of these dynamics that I believe would have been seen and projected onto the altar stone. And they reminded me of a sun dagger in my homeland, the land of enchantment. The Anasazi Native Americans who built Pueblo Bonito also had an observatory. And they had sandstone slabs that at noon, a shaft of light would come down onto a face of this butte, and it's known as a sun dagger. So the people around the world all need to come up with means of connecting to the celestial symbol, the celestial events that they're experiencing. And I'm reading in various journals that different cultures may have used the pendulum as a means of keeping time in prehistory. So just going to go show you that sun dagger disappearing. Now, these also provide some of the elements of geometry to be able to be taught to new generations of astronomers in those times. Now, if we look at these Fulton drums up on the upper surface, there's a sun symbol. But interestingly, the rays that are coming off it are very triangular. And in 2017, my family and I witnessed a total solar eclipse in Oregon. And what you see are these triangular solar flares, plasmas, which we heard about yesterday. Okay, if you go to Sumeria in Mesopotamia, the sun god symbol for Utu also has these types of triangular extensions. So are they seeing the same event, these appearance of the sun god in its form? Terence Meaden, a physicist and archaeologist, in 1985 suggested that the heel stone of Stonehenge was casting a shadow that penetrated all the way back through the Sarsens to land on the altar stone. And so one can imagine if you're using these types of stopwatches to time the shadows and shafts of light, you can be answering fundamental questions. Does the sun move at the same speed each year, or is it a constant? These are the types of things that people have pondered and we now take for granted. So part 2 of my talk, moving megaliths over water. This is the how. So yes, you can move lots of stones, 2 to 4 tons, from Palau to the island Yap. So 13,000 stone discs were shipped 450 kilometers. But these are long wavelength seas, which means there's not a lot of cresting waves. Bamboo rafts and catamarans were used. So is it feasible? Yes. Is it optimal for those types of cities? Yes. And that was money for those people, the stone discs. So now shifting to Mesopotamia, this is from the palace of the Neo-Assyrian king Sargon II, illustrating the movement of giant cedars of Lebanon to Mesopotamia by the Phoenicians. Now, the artist has compressed this. Obviously, the tow line is pretty short, and people don't put multi-ton logs on their shoulders, but they're honoring this mass transport event. So here, again, I'm emphasizing umiaks as the likely type of boat that could have been used to haul the altar stone from northern Scotland to southern England. Another type of boat that may have been used to get the stone from the mouth of the River Avon up to Stonehenge is a kellic. This is a raft made out of inflated animal skins. And the modern version of it are these marine airbags lifting this giant concrete caisson. If you go to the British Museum, you'll see winged bulls that were taken from the Palace of Nimrud. These were floated down the Tigris in 1847 on a kellic, using about 1,000 inflated goat skins. Now, there's a lot of failure modes if you just have to blow up skins each day. So they didn't have marshmallows back then. This is my marshmallow kellic. So 18 marshmallows will lift 200 grams. You can figure out the physics, how to scale that up. Sorry, I'm going to have to keep going with my plan B. Evolution of technologies, extinction of old technologies. And looking at form and function, we need to go back in time. So what was this thing over on the left, which I started in science in high school? It's called a slide rule. It started with the work of John Napier, a mathematician in Scotland, 1600s. Yeah, I'm that old. In 1976, I was working for the Eastman Kodak Company. That's how I got my start in imaging. I was working that summer at a production plant in Colorado working on silicon oil in that plastic. Now this is all museum pieces. But that summer, besides getting involved in imaging, I read The Voyage of the Beagle by Charles Darwin. And that changed my direction. I came home, had a talk with my dad. I said, Dad, I'm not going to become a doctor, and I'm not going to be a chemist. I'm going to become a biophysicist. And he said, what's a biophysicist? And I said, I don't know, but I'm going to become one. And he said, that's about the worst career reasoning I've ever heard. I can understand his point of view now. So years later, I went to my wife's lab at the University of Washington, and a grad student asked me, Mark, what does a biophysicist do? I said, a biophysicist is somebody who studies how beer and pizza gets converted into physics when fed to a physics graduate student. And that made a lot of sense to him, so here's the equation. Now, this was 30 years ago, and this is the first time I put this equation up, but in the Neolithic, were there biophysicists? I think there were. When you had to figure out how do you power all of this people power to paddle and these umiaks to pull the stone on a barge down to Stonehenge. You're going to need 4,000 calories a day. So sea haggis, this is called the sea haggis equation. Honey plus haggis plus young ancient mariner, that's your propulsion unit. So I'm going to go fast. Neolithic naval transport technologies, the barges of breadgear, evolution of ballasting. Here's the concept. Put a megalith inside a log, and it's like the internal keel of a boat. And we're going to suspend it from a keelson, a flying keelson. Now these are the hands of Brad, who is the craftsman. And how do we use some of this to help sort out some of the quandaries? Crannogs, which are present here in Orkney, but much more in the Outer Hebrides. And notice down in the lower right, these short-horned cairns. I think they might be a form of coracle. Over on the left, you see a cairn from Caithness. Looks similar to coracle that is found, you'll see, at the Curragh Heritage Centre in Ireland. So this is me with a reconstructed version of a boat, which I think is the cairn of Gett, short-horned cairn. And I've bought a basket with the right morphology. I've put plastic shrimp wrap around it. I've ballasted it with sand and cobblestones. And okay. So using this boat out on a Lake Sammamish in Washington, and we're seeing how we can do in wave action. So it's got reserve buoyancy like the Beowulf canoe from Newfoundland. So I think this is one of the forms of the boats that you might have found on Loch Stennis or Loch Harry. Okay, so, but what's what biophysicists and biologists look for is an outgroup, okay, from the longhorn cairns, which I think was what we were used to pull, could have been used to pull stones, first from Wales. And this is a paper by archaeologists in 2015, and I've just highlighted one possibility, which was the long route by sea. Could have had hybrid transport, some hauling by land and then also by water transport. So these stones at Stonehenge 68 and Stone 69, very unusually shaped, those caught my attention. I said, let's make replicas of one of those Stone 68 and put it in a giant log, and that's Brad. Okay. This is a log that's along the shores of Puget Sound. Now, how does this tie into other things we've talked about? I told you about the Cleopatra needle ship that brought an obelisk, which was 190 tons from Alexandria to London. And now you have this floating turbine barge off the waters of North Ronaldsay Island. And again, it's a tube, a steel tube, but it has ballasting in it, electrical turbines and batteries. So over there's my plastic peanut jar, which shows the basic physics. We need two stones, our main cargo and a counterweight. And I'm going to use Stone 68, theoretically, to do that. So we take a stone, we lash it to a keelson, and this altar stone, that's conceptually what we want to move. And that stick up on top, that's what we're going to wrap it to. And this way we, like a flying buttress in a cathedral, we distribute the stress so it doesn't all land on the thin hull down below. And this is called an internal keel system, ballasting system. And you'll find these on yachts, but instead they have an external keel made out of lead. So ballasting is central to these issues. And what we're going to do is use the altar stone and Stone 68 in a complex integrated ballasting system. Now, think about a container system. And imagine we have a DHL Neolithic Express. This is the type of transport system which could have been used to bring supplies and products back and forth across the Pentland Firth. Well, how big would the tree need it to be? This is a redwood that came up from California to Washington. We don't need it that big, but we need a tree about the size in the middle, and I'm the scale bar down there at the bottom. And don't chop it down, just dig out the roots, burn them, and wait for a windstorm. And that's the way the Native Americans got their large trees down for making dugouts. So I need a large log, about more than 40 tons, 0.5 density, and 2 meters at its base. That's what I'm looking for. A Scottish pine in the Caledonia forest, about 1,000 years old, would do the trick. Okay, so we're talking about the dimensions of something similar to a modern narrowboat on your canals in Britain. And you need a name for your great ship. And like I said, I'm a Finn folk, bona fide Finn folk, and I identify with the clan of the Astiochthians. That's the bony fish. So I'm going to name it after an eel, Anguillus. And that means the great eel in Latin. And I'm going to use spars to suspend stone 68 from Stonehenge and other spars, not shown here, to suspend the altar stone. That's the naval architecture strategy for making this barge that we can use to move this stone down the east coast of Britain. Now, you might say, what's the evidence for that? Well, let's take a look at a narrowboat, take it out on the sea. So you can't do that, but they do that in the wash. And that's the trajectory. They wait for the tides to change, and they intentionally ground the narrowboat on the sandbars. So what keeps the narrowboat from rolling over in the waves? Ballast. Tons of bricks, which you don't usually see when you go on board. So that's, again, the key takeaway is that we need to be thinking about Neolithic ballasting system. And that's where we're using the altar stone and stone 68 to provide that ballasting. So that helps prevent roll. And another way to optimize your ship from rolling is to put lateral stabilizers on. It's like training wheels for a paddleboard. And that's a Vietnamese fishing boat, and you can see lines of bamboo. And I'm about to make Anguillus 1, and these were not paid actors. They showed up. And as we know from Monty Python and the Holy Grail, watch out for cute, small critters. So I'll do the voiceover. The mother duck says, "Children, come look at this primate trying to attach straw haggis to a log." The ducklings say, "But Mom, he keeps changing the knots." And she says, "I don't mind him. That's just the way his mind works." Okay, so
it's not coming in. It's pretty much stabilized.
Please turn down the volume there. Okay,
even though the waves are too.
That's the voice of Brad. And that's the first flight of Anguillus 1. And those are the legs of Mark. So we got flotation. Now we need propulsion. So I'm putting a tow line on it. So this is the first sea trial of Anguillus 1. And it's loaded up with a keelstone. And it's got straw haggis lateral stabilizers. And I know what you're all thinking, those aren't waves, those aren't Orcadian waves. But the keelstone stayed in. Now, compare that approach to the work of an archaeologist, Richard Atkinson, who got some boys to try to move the stone on top of some barges back in 1954. So I've got you a barge. Now, here is what a canoe could do, an umiak with 20 rowers. And note the fellow in the back with the steering oar. Just look how stable and steerable this watercraft is. So linking and syncing, synchronizing the propulsion, it's a very powerful way to create a momentum that you can use to tow things. And you can tow logs just with a kayak. Okay, so back to the nest of Bradshaw. What impressed me is the hundreds or thousands of tons of masonry stone which were accumulated there. You don't want to be lifting those stones one at a time. You need to move them by water. So I began looking for this type of boats that could be used as barges on Loch Stennis. And I was motivated by the Tinkleswood chambered long cairn in Wales from 4000 BCE. To me, it looked like a zodiac boat, also known as a rigid inflated boat. So I've got the keelstone inside it, and now I've got a polyethylene tube for lateral stability, and I've got a couple of bricks up on top. And success, they're not falling off, they're not rolling. That's because of the internal ballasting and the lateral stability. Based upon the Neolithic cairn, that's my motivation for this. Now, control experiment, flip it over, and it's stable in that state, and yet, through the work of Brad, by wedging it in and lashing it in, the keelstone doesn't fall out. So now that was Anguillus 1. This is Anguillus 2. And yes, this is last year's Christmas tree. So working with Brad, we've milled out a couple of spots for the altar stone and stone 68. And we're going to add lateral pontoons just like a submarine. And just like a submarine moves quickly on the surface of the water, Anguillus 2 does too. And this is the same type of physics that's your new power station up on North Ronaldsay, this orbital floating turbine barge. So, okay, now I'm at Lake Washington, and at the upper part you can see the stone 68, scaled down, plus the altar stone, with suspended by keelsons and lodged into the log. And we're about to, I've added some straw haggis as grappling pontoons. And why do you have grappling pontoons to your barge? Well, if you need to pass the barge from one umiak to another, you can use a sea hook, like a sheep, and hook it. And that one at the back adds drag, which keeps it from fishtailing. So this first sea test of Anguillus 2 was a success. And I would like to just emphasize that the basic physics and nautical engineering is similar to the turbine that you have now installed up in North Ronaldsay. This is barges with tow lines fore and aft as it's being towed up through your seas. And so, yeah, you can make models like this, and then you need to ask engineers, wizards, to see if it's scalable. So this is one possibility by which your ancestors could have potentially used to transport the altar stone from up here down to the mouth of the river. So this is Anguillus 2 with keelsons. I've added some dorsal pontoons for extra stability, and now you'll see its response in more dynamic wave action. See, it didn't roll over. And we still got our transport, our cargo. So, this basic idea of putting a stone inside a barge, well, we've seen it be used to transport Cleopatra's Needle. And so, in conclusion, I'd like to quote my paternal grandfather, Dennis Scott Cooper, which I got my middle name from. He's taught me, imagination is faster than the speed of light. So I've shown you how broad-haired butterflies might represent celestial symbols, ways of encoding space-time, how solar flares may have been seen by various peoples around the world and encoded into their art, and the dynamics of the celestial deities on the horizon, the great horizon, encoded into art objects like the Nebris sky disk. I'm showing you a Neolithic pendulum that we can use as a stopwatch to get finer resolution of these celestial dynamics. And we're going to have one more slide here. So I'd like to take you back to the Wizard of New Mexico after I first mentioned again, sea haggis. Oh, 2 weeks ago, my equation, beer plus pizza plus physics grad student, well, it was confirmed by 2 Scottish brothers who sailed, took 139 days, they paddled from Peru to Australia, and they called for beer and pizza when they arrived. So after 30 years of prior theoretical study, I've been validated. That's what we live for. But the sea haggis, I think they either put honey in the haggis or they made honey scones, but you need fast-acting carbohydrates for those paddlers. So in conclusion, if there's a message, one of the many messages that's hidden in Stonehenge, if I can bring to you, is from Stone 68, a putative keelstone. May the force of the keelstone be with you.
Great talk, Mark. Absolutely thought-provoking talk. And I could hear all the oohs and ahs and laughing and stuff. It was great. There's bound to be questions for Mark, bound to be thoughts. So while we've got Mark, let's just put your hand up, and Lorna's got the roving mic and she'll come to you so you can ask Mark any questions. There's one up the top.
Stop first.
Yeah, it's always fun.
Hi, I'm Andrew Appleby. I devised a method of moving these great big stones by having large, I haven't actually done it practically, it's only a mind experiment, but having fairly large dugout canoes, but you turn them upside down and raft them so that they're full of air and have far greater buoyancy. And I think that might work quite well.
So that's an interesting idea. So you're suggesting to put an air pocket.
Yeah.
I would upgrade your idea to a straw haggis so that doesn't, you can't, if you make the straw haggis waterproof, then that would be a permanent fix. You would have that buoyancy there.
Mm-hmm.
But I like what you're suggesting, because then you're adding more buoyancy above the water line. And that's going to create what's called a torque couple,
Mm-hmm.
which is what nautical engineers aim for in terms of boat stability. So thank you for that one.
Okay, cheers.
Okay, I will be glad to let you all have a go at a Neolithic stop pocket piece at the Q&A session up there, if you like. Oh, there's one more question.
Hello. How did they move this altar stone from the sea to to Stonehenge?
Sorry.
How did they move it from the sea onto the land? Did they use rollers? Did they use seaweed? Did they use seaweed on top of rollers? Or
Yeah, the River Avon, I'm going to answer, I think, part of the question. If you use this giant log, you could potentially get it all the way down from Orkney to the mouth of the River Avon. But now we have a water that's only about 2 feet deep, okay? And so that's where you need to go to that marshmallow kellic model. But instead, we're going to use stuffed cow skins, stuffed with dried barley straw. And we can now get enough lift from those marine airbags to keep it so that we have 6 inches or 1 foot of clearance between the bottom of the River Avon and where the stone is. So that's testable. But I think you potentially could use any one of the mechanical means to move it on land. But what intrigued me is that, from what I understand of the archaeology, when the bluestones were first moved from Wales to Stonehenge, they were built into a ring called Blue Stonehenge, which is right next to the River Avon. And later, those were then moved up on a slight hill to their permanent location. So I think those bluestones are much smaller than the sarsens and smaller than the altar stone. So I think at that time, you could have used a kellic to get them up the River Avon. So I don't know if I answered your question, but if I didn't, can you re-ask the next part? Did I? Okay.
In the Neolithic times, was there a significant difference in the tidal range between the low tide when they're putting the raft into position and the high tide when they're hopefully being able to float the big stone plus raft away? Thank you.
Yes, totally agree. After the festival, I'm headed to Dunnet Beach over in Caithness, next to Dunnet Head. And what I've seen is that the rock falls off of Dunnet Head litter the beach with these giant sandstone slabs. And so using the kellic approach, the stuffed animal skins, you could float them, as you point out. Use nature's hydraulic lift. When at low tide, you attach the timbers and the stuffed animal skins. Let the tide come in, lift it. Then use your umiak to pull it over to Dunnet Beach, where you keep it in position until you can bring in your giant Caledonian Scottish pine log, and then that's the way you could move it from a easily accessible quarry site to that staging point. Stages in the floating?
Like you do a small lift and then a bigger lift.
Oh, yes. And then, I also had thinking along your lines of thinking, you have to go with the flow of the tides. And that's a simpler way to move it. It's just, when the tides are moving south, you pull your raft out and you let the tidal flow take you in. And then when the tides begin to turn, you bring the barge closer to shore and anchor it. And that way, the young ancient mariners can go party on the beach, refresh themselves with honey. I think that they used honey as money back then. And if you wanted to get on board and have a go at paddling, that you had to come, the local farm kids would have to come with jars of honey and pay their chance to get on the board. But it probably was the entire, Britain and Ireland knew about, this effort to move this giant stone. And who wouldn't want to be on board on the transport?
I'm going to take one more question at this session, Mark, then I'll close up and I'll explain how people can talk to you after.
This question is an observation, really, links back to what you said about Micronesia, Yap, and the stone money.
Yes.
There's actually quite a lot of money never made it. It's on the bottom of the ocean, and it's still got value because they treat that as a bank. So presumably with this, it didn't have to be one hit. If it didn't work, they lost it at sea. They could have another go and have another go.
Yes.
But I don't know if there's anything in carvings or anything that might point to that.
One question, are you an engineer?
Might be.
Well, that's what engineers call a failure mode. When the raft turns over and dumps or sinks. And the wizards, I don't know if they ever admit to failure modes, but I was reading a bit about that stone money in the Isle of Yap. Each of the stones has a story associated with it. And if you lose at poker, they just they had the stone in the middle of the village, and they say, okay, you own it, and the status of that worth of that stone transfers to you. So the idea of ownership of, this isn't unique to Stonehenge. When they built the giant passage tomb at Newgrange, it's the biggest passage tomb that they know in the Neolithic world, the British architects brought stones, quartz stones and black stones from like 100 kilometers away. And then the curb stones come from a quarry right there on the sea called Cloggerhead. And they believe, they're Irish archaeologists, that those stones, hundreds of them, were moved up the River Boyne. And that's where this kellic would come into play. But you still need propulsion and lateral stability, and there's going to be failure modes. So maybe some of those curb stones will someday be found in the bottom of the River Boyne, and we'll know that they were probably transported by water.
Right, I'm going to wrap up this formal session here just now, but if you want to talk to Mark or quiz him or whatever, we can go up to the Grain room, which is up the top back right as you're sitting. We've got tea and coffee and biscuits and an honesty box to pay for them if you want. So, but in the meantime, could we thank Mark Cooper for that absolutely fantastic talk. Thank you.